Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. Today's video is about the Tangled quilt pattern and why I think it's so great for shirts. And you know, I have a lot to say about it, so stay with me. So let's get to it. Our topic today is the Tangled quilt pattern by Cluck Cluck Sew. That cracks me up every time, Cluck Cluck Sew. I have been working on this quilt top, if the whole quilt is not done yet. So you may have seen it on my design wall. And of course, it started with me making my own jelly roll. So I did that. And then it was National Jelly Roll Day. And so I used that jelly roll to make this quilt. I suspected from the beginning that it would be a great quilt pattern for shirts. But, you know, sometimes as I get going, I'm like, oh, it's a great pattern, but maybe not great for shirts. This one is great for shirts. So it's great for a lot of things. It's great for shirts. I used a sheet for the background. It's jelly roll friendly. It's layer cake friendly. And I think it may have fat quarter directions as well. So it's very versatile for the different types of fabrics that you may have, or I guess the sources of fabrics. So if you want to use your stash or your scraps, it's maybe not scraps, but your stash, it's really great because the layout of the block is just so versatile and functional and really fun. Before I go any further, I do like to talk about great quilt patterns. It's been a hot minute, really, since I've had a great quilt pattern video. And you may wonder, like, why do I think that a certain pattern is great? So my criteria is, especially for shirts, the whole deal with shirts is you have a limited amount within a shirt. And sometimes if you're a memory quilt maker, you have a limited number of shirts. That poses some challenges to some quilt patterns. And so I just like to try them out and see how it works. And this one fit the bill. I don't know what her actual designation is for the quilt pattern, but I would say it's beginner friendly. It's all squares and rectangles, sewing on right angles, which is always nice and a little easier, and doesn't require a lot of trimming like you do with flying geese or half square triangles. So it's a little on the easier side of the spectrum of difficulty. So that makes it great. It has a very interesting look about it. Now, we don't have it on the design wall. I have it on my table. So you can see the whole pattern, the whole entire quilt here. It has a very interesting interwoven look about it, but it is a block-based quilt pattern, which I just personally like. Maybe that's just preference because I am not a full-time quilter, and so I can do a block and then, go to work and then come home and do another block. It's pretty easy on the skill level, and because it's block-based, you don't have to commit to one long marathon sewing session or worry about leaving it and then not knowing where you left off. There are some things that I think are especially good. And then there are a couple of things that are, I don't even know that I would say challenging. It's just something to consider, especially if you're going to use shirts. So the quilt pattern has multiple sizes, which I really love, from crib all the way up to king. So let me make the caveat that it is so good for shirts, but as you get further up in the sizes, you may not find that it's as easy to use shirts for your background. So I think I probably could have managed it with a couple of shirts on this throw size, which is 60 by 70, and it's the cover size. But if I had gone further up from the throw size into twin, king, or queen or king, it's not great from the background standpoint for shirts. So if you have a sheet, which is what I use, it's great. But if you're trying to do the entire quilt top with shirts, you're probably going to have to reach out to yardage for your background. Just know that. So the actual blocks, the colored and printed parts, fantastic for shirts. Not background, not as fantastic for shirts if you start getting up in size. I found that in making this, now again, I used a jelly roll, but it was a jelly roll of my own making. So I used essentially shirts, and I used some fat quarters. I used a little bit of everything actually in this quilt. And if you have good accuracy in your cutting, or if you have a pre-cut jelly roll, for example, or layer cakes, it's probably going to be even easier. I want to show you one of the challenges that I had, and I want this to be an encouragement to you, especially if you're a newer quilter, or if perhaps accuracy isn't always your best gift, because I had some oopsies, and I want to show you how really it's not even very visible. In making my own jelly roll, apparently I had a little difficulty with this bright French's mustard fabric. It's not a shirt. It was actually yardage. And maybe that's why I had difficulty. I use so many shirts when I'm given real yardage. I'm like, what is this? But anyway, so I basically shortcut my yellow jelly roll strip. Did not know this until the block was made, and really didn't even know it until I started putting the blocks together. Because as you're doing an individual block, everything came together just fine with my 1/4 inch seam allowance. But as I started putting the blocks together to each other and then the rows together, what I found was that my little yellow strips were just a little too skinny. If there is such a thing as too skinny in all walks of life. But this yellow strip fell into that category. And so what happened to me is I went to sew it to the row and realized immediately that it did not match up. And this is one of the beauties of this quilt, and also a potential difficulty, is the way the design works best is if everything is kind of matches up on that line, so that it looks kind of continual and therefore interlocked or interwoven, or however you want to word that. If you miss it, like I did, then you get a wide strip like this one, and then the skinny strips don't come together on the corner. Let me get my purple thing so I can show you without being rude and pointing. Right here, actually, everywhere that this yellow block connects to the other blocks. This one is probably, actually, this one and this one are the most grievous. That's a pretty big gap right there. And again, right here. And of course, the way I arranged my blocks was to have my light yellow right up against these really dark and vibrant shirts. And so it's kind of obvious, except when I had it out opened up and on the design wall in my dining room, I was like, oh, that's okay. And couldn't tell. So once I get this quilted, no one will know. And one of the things that is great is if you miss it as you're sewing your blocks together, what you can do is lay one block on top of the other. So, you lay them together to match the seam up, right there. So this is where I'm talking about. And of course, as soon as I did that, I was like, oh gosh, these don't match. So what I did is I actually took that block and laid it down on top of the other and cheated in. And let me show you that a little bit. Now this is it cuts into my seam allowance right there. But what I realized, it was just off all the way around. And so I used the block itself and the block that it was next to figure out kind of, oh, okay, that's a little off, but it's a little off on every way. And so if I cheat in my seam allowance, if I ease it in, then it still works. And because the pressing directions are outstanding, we will come back to that. It nests in every direction. So as you're getting ready to sew your blocks together, if it doesn't come together at one place, you can lay it one on top of the other and kind of get the lay of the land with all of the blocks that are around it and discover, okay, do I need to just cheat in my seam allowance, or do I need to, do something different to compensate for it? So that was a little bit of a difficulty, basically because I had errors in my cutting. It has nothing to do with the pattern, but I wanted to mention it because when you have a great quilt pattern, really of all types, if you have those little errors and imperfections, if the overall quilt top when it's made and then quilt in total doesn't show it, I mean, ding, it's like perfect, because there's room for those little imperfections that we all have as we're sewing. I discovered at the end that some of my blocks, which I've discovered it as I started sewing the blocks together in rows, I had some slightly larger blocks and some slightly smaller blocks. And had I taken the time to trim the wider or larger ones down to the required block size, it probably would have gone a little easier when I put the blocks and rows together. So I guess that's kind of a tip. I'm sure it's probably in the instructions somewhere. This is what your block size should be. If it's not, trim it down. You can definitely ease your blocks together. So if you don't take the time to trim, or if you're anti-trimming, if you follow the directions and have accurate cutting, they really come together beautifully. I'm not sure that there's a need for trimming, but you can trim them if you cut a little wider or if your blocks ended up a little bit larger. So it does not require trimming, but probably would make for a more accurate end result. Before I go on, let me say, I don't give away the dimensions of the blocks in these videos if the pattern is available for sale, out of respect for the creative property of the quilt designer. So sometimes I have comments where people say, how big is the finished block, or how big are the pieces? Some of you can figure that out, and I understand that, but this quilt designer did a beautiful job putting together a beautiful quilt design. And out of respect for her and her creative property, I just don't give that information. But it is available on her website, and we will have that in the description box. So please feel free to go and get her quilt pattern, because it's great. All right, so that's that. Another reason this quilt is good for shirts is a lot of shirts that you may find, or if you're a memory quilt maker, you probably have been given a number of plaid shirts. Some people avoid plaid. Some quilters avoid plaid like the plague. And I get it, especially if you really like for those lines to line up. And I usually find myself in that camp. So this may just be documentation of my liberation from perfectionism. I don't know. Maybe I'm finally letting go a little bit. It is actually really great in this quilt pattern to see how the plaid comes together. And there's a certain aspect of it would be really tricky to get a plaid perfectly together. And so it's kind of freeing. I have two examples of this because I don't know, plaids don't bother me. This first one is probably the most obviously not matching. And so we're going to go there. You can see this is a complex plaid, so it's not symmetrical really in any way. This was actually my favorite of all of the fabrics in this quilt. It was a shirt and I loved it. And it kind of was part of the inspiration of the whole thing. And it didn't occur to me when I started that it was going to be all chopped up and mixed up and put back together, which I don't know why it didn't, because that's quilting. But anyway, so I had the jelly roll strip and I just cut the pieces and sewed it together. When it came time to put these units together. So there's this strip, and so this unit, and this unit together. I did find myself trying to turn it and turn it again and turn it again so that there was some continual line of like any one of these colors. Like I thought, okay, if I can get the yellow stripe kind of continuous, okay, it just didn't work. And so I kept turning and turning. And when I realized this is not going to happen, I was like, oh, well, and sewed it together. And when I got it together, what I discovered was, yes, it is obvious that the plaids do not connect, like through this whole, it kind of looks like a twist. Actually, it looks like one of those ribbons for breast cancer awareness or the red AIDS one, like it's been folded over back on itself, which I really like. And you can tell it's very obvious it does not match up. But what I have discovered, at least in this quilt pattern, it just looks interesting to me. And it gives it some visual movement and interest. Now, if this is not your jam, totally get that. And I would just say either use a symmetrical plaid or a check like gingham, because you can get that lined up. It's much harder with a complex plaid. But what has happened is I think I like this shirt even more in this block. Another example is over here, just one messed up block away. This one is also plaid. It's very subtle. It's just this kind of orangey red with a dark navy and white stripes and plaid. Yeah, I guess that's plaid. That's not stripe. Not only did it not match up, I actually didn't even perhaps cut it totally square. So in a previous video, when I talked about plaids, I talk about as you cut it, if you use the straight lines of the plaid as your XY axis and line that up either with your ruler or on your cutting mat, you can generally cut your pieces straight. And so the plaid retains its horizontal and vertical 90 degrees. And it's straight together with the pieces, especially if you're using a lot of right angles in your quilting. So if you're not using half square triangles or stars or whatever, flying geese. I was struggling to find the phrase flying geese. I don't know. If you cut them straight, then you have a far better shot of them being either matching up or at least being, kind of on the line. I don't know what happened with my cutting of this particular jelly roll strip. I don't know if I had it like stacked under another one. Not sure. But there are some subtly crooked strips in this little block right here. So because of that, not only does it not line up, it's also not really straight. And again, I say, who would notice? And if the person noticed, who would care? And if they cared, why are we giving them a quilt? I'm just assuming we're giving them a quilt. Ultimately, though, my point here, clearly, is it really doesn't matter. If you're okay with it not exactly matching up, or maybe not even being straight on the line, I really don't think that this particular quilt pattern, its beauty is dependent on your plaids being straight. There are some quilt patterns that I have seen that the straighter your plaids are, the prettier the quilt pattern is. I think this one, it's basically irrelevant, which to me makes it such a great quilt pattern. So it's very forgiving in terms of accuracy. And then if you are using shirts and they don't match up, in the global quilt top, it just gives it some interest and doesn't really detract from the design. And in fact, your eye might be drawn to or away from it. And that's part of what makes quilting so great and quilts so beautiful. My very favorite feature of this quilt pattern is the most excellent pressing direction that Cluck Cluck Sew gives us for this quilt. I sometimes argue with quilt patterns as I'm making them, aka arguing with the quilt designer who's not present. Like, no, we don't press that open. It should be to the dark side. Each block is made, and every single seam, she gives us pressing directions. And if you follow them to the letter, every block nests. Every seam nests within the block, and every seam nests from the row, and every row nests with the row above it and below it. And oh my goodness, is that not the best? It's absolutely the best. I love it. So the way it's made is you make each block exactly the same as each other. And then when you go to put it together, there's a rotation that makes the design and then makes each link up together in this beautiful design. It's like magic. I really felt like as I was pressing each piece, I was like, oh, okay, I don't know that I would have pressed this way. And then put the pieces within the block together. Oh, that makes sense. And then put the blocks together. Oh, well, that makes sense. And then as I started putting the rows together, I seriously thought that I was practicing magic. Like, look at me being so great. So that to me, maybe other than the beauty of the quilt. So kudos and a big hearty thank you to you, Allison, for your fantastic pressing directions. I know that seems so silly, but it's wonderful when you've put the work into making these blocks and then go to put them together and you have the additional security of the nesting to know that you've done it right. That's just the best. All right. Before I move on, I do want to point out that you can use all different sorts of fabric types. And sometimes that's a challenge, especially with shirt quilts and memory quilts. If the shirts that you've been given as a memory quilt maker are, you've got some flannel, you've got some chambray, you've got some just regular old work shirts. Some patterns, especially if they're particularly intricate, can cause difficulty with the thickness of the shirt and how that pulls and all that kind of good stuff, in my experience. I put every kind of fabric in this quilt. So I have a flannel type men's shirt. This is actually flannel yardage. This is actually a pretty thin shirt, this green plaid that I just absolutely adore. This dark green is a really thick twill. And the reds are thick twill as well. And then because I have orange linen and this is a fall inspired quilt, I also have linen in this quilt, which, I guess that's just me using shirts in a quilt. I use what I have. So if you are a person who uses what you have and you think, oh, but can I? Yeah, you can. And because the block layout is so good, again, we're not talking about very intricate piecing or piecing on the bias or angles. It really just comes together pretty easily. And because the pressing directions are so good, if you have a thick fabric next to a thin fabric, the pressing directions, in most cases, for me, worked in my favor. There is an interesting aspect to this quilt pattern. I have not had this before. Initially, it took some mental energy for me, and that is the Scrappy block. The whole quilt is designed to have multiple Scrappy blocks throughout, using the pieces that were left over from either your layer cake or your jelly roll or your whatever pieces. So you could, in theory, make all of the blocks with solids and prints and no variation. But what I found was that the Scrappy blocks are the most fun, and they give each row a point of interest, and it kind of breaks up the overall design a little bit and simultaneously ties it back together. if that makes sense. It's kind of paradoxical. As you look at the overall quilt, again, we'll show you a picture. It's almost like to keep it from being, oh, there's a green block, there's an orange block, there's a red block. You'll be kind of doing that with your eyes and then come upon a block that has multiple colors and prints in it. And it just gives it, again, some movement and interest and kind of keeps it broken up, but also ties in the other blocks to each other. So that's what this block is. You can see me pointing to it. And like I said, this has flannel yardage, flannel shirt, thick twill shirt, fat quarter, and a thin shirt together. What I did find, and this is not going to be maybe a surprise to you, putting together the Scrappy blocks initially was not very easy for me. And if you are like me and Janet Jackson, a person who needs a little control in your Scrappy, it becomes a time to play around with fabrics and figure out what combinations you like, especially together. My initial putting the blocks together, I just don't do random. And so I had this pile of pieces and then figuring out how I wanted those together initially was frustrating for me. I'll be really honest. I think it's because I like curating my Scrappy. And I know that probably is an oxymoron for some people. A lot of people, Scrappy means just throw stuff at it and keep throwing stuff at it, and it works out in the end. And that is usually true. I just don't do that very well. And so I like to curate my Scrappy so that I like, for example, I loved this kind of burgundy / brick up against this baby crap green and the red. I liked that combination together. And then I thought that the green plaid shirt, that color is very close to this kind of mustardy, greeny mustard. And then this led into the yellow, and then this little swirly here to me is very close. I just liked the flow of those colors together. I think I have probably a couple of blocks that look so very similar to this, even though they're Scrappy, because I just like that combination. Let me turn it over and show you another one. So here's another of my Scrappy blocks. I like this one less, to be honest with you. I don't dislike it at all. I just like it less. I could probably sit here and think long enough and tell you why. I do like the orange, light orange, dark orange, and the yellow together. And I like the red and the kind of ochre. Is that what that is? Burnt sienna, one of those colors from the crayon box. And then this that looks like bark. I don't love the greens here, and I think it needs more print. For you, if you make this quilt pattern, and you should, the Scrappy blocks might be a delight, or it might be a little bit of a challenge. It was both for me. So sometimes I just happened on a combination that I loved, and I was doing this while we were watching television, and I would go, ooh. And then sometimes I'm like, I think that green is a little too blue. Oh, well, what that does in the end result of the quilt is it does just give it some variety. That's the word I was looking for. Not just interest and movement, but variety, and ties in all of these gorgeous, and in my case, fall inspired colors together. And so that's really a wonderful aspect of the pattern as well. Side note, if you do use flannel, either shirts or plain flannel, and I think this would be good for flannel and for linen. Like if you wanted to do the whole thing linen, because it's all right angles. Same thing for linen. I mean, gosh, if I could get my love for linen out and make my mouth say something other than linen, that would be great. Same for flannel. It likes right angles, and so it works really well. But if you're using different substrates in the same quilt, I would encourage you not to use steam when you do your blocking, because sometimes the flannel and linen for sure, if you use steam, it'll stretch and might distort your block and make it a little bit harder to match up as you put your blocks in rows together. So just a tip there. I think that's about it, really, which, I mean, that's a lot, that there are just so many good aspects to this quilt pattern. It's written really well. It's easy to follow. I can't say enough about the pressing directions. And just as a bonus, and I love it when quilt pattern designers do this, she included a coloring page. So if you were having a hard time visualizing what your particular colorway would look like, you can print it and color it in and go, oh, yeah, that's beautiful, which is usually what happens. So that's it for today and this great quilt pattern for shirts and thrifted fabrics from your local store. I really encourage you to go check out Cluck Cluck Sew and this quilt pattern and let me know if you've made it and enjoy it. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thank you so much for watching.